From the earliest days of human culture, people have wondered what it would mean to bring thought into being outside the boundaries of their own minds. The notion of artificial intelligence is not just a modern technical phrase, but a long thread that connects myths, philosophy, and engineering. When we speak of artificial intelligence today, we refer to machines and systems that can perform tasks requiring reasoning, learning, and adaptation. Yet behind this definition lies a much older dream, the dream of creating something that could imitate the spark of human thought, perhaps even surpass it. This dream is woven into our stories, our inventions, and our anxieties about the nature of life and the boundaries of human power. In ancient cultures, the idea of artificial beings was already alive. Homer's epics tell of Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, who forged golden servants that could move and assist as if alive. These were not simply machines but embodiments of the human wish to reproduce intelligence and autonomy. Similarly, the myth of Pygmalion, in which a sculptor brings his statue to life through devotion and divine favor, suggests that humans have long linked creativity with the possibility of generating life where there was none. In Jewish mysticism, the legend of the golem, an artificial figure molded from clay and animated through sacred words, expressed both hope and fear about human power to give form to intelligence. These stories are not about circuits or algorithms, but they circle around the same questions that preoccupy researchers today. Can we reproduce the qualities that make thought possible? And if we succeed, what will this creation mean for us? When philosophers in antiquity and later centuries debated the nature of the soul and reason, they often did so in mechanical metaphors. To think of the mind as a kind of machine is not purely a modern invention. The mechanistic philosophies of Descartes and Leibniz suggested that reasoning could, at least in principle, be expressed in clear rules, much like the gears of a clockwork device. Leibniz imagined a calculus of thought that could resolve disputes as simply as arithmetic resolves sums. These reflections did not yet produce working devices, but they laid a foundation for considering intelligence as something that could, at least in part, be abstracted and transferred into a non-human medium. At the same time, the myths of artificial beings also warned of danger. The golem, once created, might act beyond the control of its maker. In Greek tales, creations given life sometimes turn destructive, raising the specter that human attempts to rival divine power would backfire. Even in the age of automata in the 17th and 18th centuries, when elaborate mechanical dolls imitated life, audiences were unsettled by the lifelike qualities of machines. The fascination was always double-edged, admiration for ingenuity blended with unease about what it might mean for human uniqueness. The modern concept of artificial intelligence crystallizes these centuries of thought into a scientific project. To create intelligence is no longer the work of myth or mysticism but of circuits, code, and data. Yet the central question remains as profound as ever. When we attempt to create intelligence, are we simply building tools that extend human capacities, or are we engaging in something more radical, the birth of a new form of mind? The answer is not simple, for intelligence itself resists precise definition. It is problem-solving, but also creativity. It is memory, but also imagination. It is logic, but also intuition. What unites the ancient myths, the philosophical debates, and the laboratories of today is the human desire to cross the boundary between the living and the artificial. The yearning to give machines thought is bound up with questions of identity, mortality, and meaning. If intelligence can be made, then what, finally, makes us human? Is it merely the substrate of flesh, or is it something deeper that no machine could ever imitate? As technology advances, these questions acquire urgency, but they are not new. They are echoes of voices that have been with us for millennia, urging us to consider what it means to create intelligence and, perhaps, to be created in turn. In the long history of humanity's attempt to imitate life, the ancient and medieval ages stand as remarkable testaments to how deeply the fascination with artificial motion and mechanical beings had already taken root. Long before the age of electronics, long before computers and algorithms, artisans, mathematicians, and engineers devoted their genius to machines that seemed to breathe, walk, sing, and perform tasks on their own. These creations were not yet artificial intelligence in the modern sense, for they had no capacity to reason or adapt, but they were powerful expressions of the human wish to endow inert matter with animation. They reveal a continuous tradition that saw ingenuity not only as a way to serve practical needs but also as a way to probe the boundaries between nature and artifice. One of the earliest and most influential figures in this tradition was Hero of Alexandria, the Greek mathematician and engineer who lived in the 1st century of our era. Hero's works describe a range of ingenious devices powered by water, steam, and simple mechanics. Among his many inventions was the aeolipile, a steam-driven sphere that rotated when heated, often described as a primitive steam engine. While Hero did not use his device for industrial purposes, it showed an early grasp of the potential energy transformations that could one day power entire civilizations. Even more fascinating were his automata, mechanical theaters that could perform plays with moving figures, temple doors that opened seemingly by themselves, and devices that mimicked the agency of living beings. To audiences in Alexandria, these were more than clever toys. They were glimpses of a world in which machines could act with a degree of independence, blurring the line between craftsmanship and life. Centuries later, as knowledge traveled along trade routes and through translations of Greek and Persian texts, similar mechanical wonders emerged in the Islamic world. The engineer Al-Jazari, working in the 12th and early 13th centuries in what is now southeastern Turkey, produced a compendium of devices that combined artistry with functional brilliance. His book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices described water clocks adorned with automated figures, machines that poured drinks, and musical automata capable of producing performances. One of his most celebrated inventions was a water-powered mechanism in which musicians played drums and other instruments as water flowed through the system, creating both rhythm and spectacle. These machines were more than entertainment, they embodied a profound understanding of hydraulics and mechanics, and they expressed the cultural fascination with merging the aesthetic and the technical. In China, too, the tradition of mechanical marvels flourished, particularly during the Song dynasty. Court inventors and engineers developed intricate clock towers with moving celestial models that displayed the heavens in motion, blending astronomy with mechanics. Su Song, an 11th century polymath, constructed a monumental clock tower that incorporated an escapement mechanism centuries before similar devices appeared in Europe. This tower not only kept time but animated figures to announce hours and display astronomical cycles, creating a cosmic theater of moving parts that reflected both scientific ambition and a sense of wonder at the harmony of the heavens. For those who witnessed it, such machines were more than tools of measurement, they were microcosms, mechanical representations of life, order, and intelligence. What unites Hero, Al-Jazari, Su Song, and countless other inventors is the drive to reproduce aspects of living systems through mechanical means. Their automata did not think, but they acted, and action was often enough to inspire awe. When a set of gears and pulleys could open temple doors without human touch, it seemed almost magical, as though the mechanism itself possessed intention. When lifelike figures struck bells or moved in procession, spectators might have felt that the line between the animate and the inanimate was thinner than they had believed. This illusion of autonomy, the appearance of agency in a machine, became one of the defining features of early attempts to reproduce life. At the heart of these creations lay a symbolic significance as well. To design a device that imitated the stars or mimicked musicians was not only to demonstrate technical skill, but also to suggest that the world itself might be understood as a vast mechanism. If the heavens could be represented by gears and escapements, then perhaps nature itself operated by hidden rules that humans could uncover and replicate. The medieval fascination with automata was therefore tied to a deeper philosophical current, the conviction that reality might be ordered, predictable, and ultimately reproducible through human ingenuity. These ancient and medieval machines were celebrated as marvels at courts, temples, and festivals, but they also provoked reflection about the limits of artifice. How close could a machine come to life? Could movement alone convince us that something was alive, or was there an essence that forever separated the mechanical from the biological? These questions echoed through centuries of invention and still resonate in modern discussions of artificial intelligence. Hero's temple doors and Al-Jazari's musical automata may seem distant from today's neural networks, yet the emotional impact they produced, wonder, unease, admiration, was strikingly similar to what people feel when confronted with intelligent software today. The sense that humans could build not just tools but beings has been with us for far longer than we often imagine. In looking back at the creations of Alexandria, Damascus, and Kyphone, we see more than clever mechanical tricks. We see the origins of a tradition that sought to bridge the gap between the living and the artificial, to capture in metal, wood, and water the rhythms and behaviors of life. These machines did not yet think, but they prepared the imagination for the idea that one day they might. The dream of artificial intelligence begins here, in the whir of gears and the flow of water, in the delight of audiences watching lifeless matter move as if animated by spirit. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe entered an age in which mechanical ingenuity reached a new height. The Renaissance had revived ancient texts on engineering, and the growing fascination with mathematics, physics, and anatomy pushed artisans and inventors to create machines that were more complex, more lifelike, and more unsettling than anything seen before. The automata of this period were not hidden in temples or confined to the courts of emperors. They became central attractions in salons, exhibitions, and royal palaces. These machines, often crafted with extraordinary delicacy and artistry, were not just technical feats but philosophical provocations. They suggested that the secrets of life itself might be approached through wheels, springs, and gears. To audiences dazzled by their precision, they raised questions about the boundaries between the natural and the artificial, the animate and the inanimate, and even the soul and the body. Among the most famous of these creations was Jack de Vaucanson's so-called digesting duck, unveiled in the 1730s. Vaucanson was a French engineer who embodied the Enlightenment spirit of curiosity and mechanical mastery. His duck was not merely a toy, it was a marvel of engineering designed to imitate the processes of life with startling accuracy. The automaton could flap its wings, drink water, eat grain, and, most provocatively, appear to digest and excrete its food. The mechanism inside, composed of elaborate tubing and chambers, was meant to simulate the internal organs of a living animal. Though the digestion was largely an illusion, food placed in the duck was replaced by preloaded matter. The effect on contemporary audiences was electrifying. Here was a machine that did not simply move but seemed to perform the hidden functions of biology. Vaucanson's duck became a symbol of Enlightenment ingenuity, a demonstration that life could be imitated in startling detail by mechanical means. Vaucanson's other automata included a flute-playing figure capable of producing notes through air blown across real instruments, with moving fingers and lips carefully constructed to replicate human physiology. In such inventions, one sees not only entertainment but a scientific exploration of how motion, sound, and organic processes might be broken down into mechanical parts. For Vaucanson and his admirers, the boundary between life and machine appeared more permeable than ever before. His creations embodied a conviction that the mysteries of nature could be revealed, understood, and reproduced through engineering. But Vaucanson was not alone. Across Europe, clockmakers and craftsmen were producing timepieces that incorporated elaborate figurines and moving tableaus. The clock was more than a device for telling time, it was a theatre of motion. Figures struck bells, animals trotted out at the hour, and entire miniature dramas unfolded as gears turned silently beneath the casing. In Augsburg, in Geneva, in Paris, these clocks served as symbols of both wealth and intellectual prestige. They condensed the new mechanical worldview into a single object. The universe itself, many thinkers argued, was like a great clock, with its motions determined by hidden mechanisms set into place at creation. To own a clock that reproduced such motions was to participate in that vision of order, precision, and divine engineering. Musical automata also became popular, blending artistry with mechanics. Miniature orchestras were crafted in which figures struck drums, bowed strings, and played wind instruments. These devices did not generate sound electronically but mechanically, with bellows, hammers, and tuned components that created real music. The effect was both delightful and uncanny. A song played by a human musician carried the warmth of intention and expression, but when a gilded doll performed the same melody flawlessly, it raised uncomfortable questions. Was music simply a matter of correct timing and movement? Could the soul of art be reduced to mechanics? Audiences oscillated between wonder at the craftsmanship and unease at the implications. The popularity of such automata cannot be separated from the intellectual climate of the Enlightenment. This was a period when philosophers and scientists debated the nature of life with unprecedented intensity. If the body was a machine, as Descartes had argued, then it should be possible to reproduce its functions through artifice. If thought itself might be seen as a kind of calculation, then perhaps even intelligence could one day be manufactured. Automata, whether in the form of ducks, flutists, or clockwork musicians, were physical demonstrations of these ideas. They suggested that movement, coordination, even expression could be achieved without life, without soul, without intention. In this sense, they were both scientific experiments and philosophical arguments, embodied in brass, leather, and wood. For many, these mechanical dolls reshaped the way intelligence itself was imagined. They blurred categories that had once seemed secure. If a machine could play a flute convincingly, then what separated human artistry from mechanical imitation? If a duck could simulate digestion, then where did physiology end and consciousness begin? Automata forced audiences to confront the possibility that what appeared to be uniquely human might in fact be reproducible. They did not provide the answers, but they made the questions unavoidable. There was also a darker undercurrent to the fascination with lifelike machines. While many saw them as triumphs of human ingenuity, others felt a shiver of unease. The more convincingly these dolls imitated life, the more they threatened to destabilize cherished beliefs about the uniqueness of living beings. In some circles, automata were treated not merely as curiosities but as challenges to religious and philosophical doctrines. If man could reproduce the functions of life, then what role was left for the divine spark? Could the soul itself be dismissed as a convenient illusion, a name for what was ultimately only mechanics? These questions resonated uneasily in a Europe still shaped by religious traditions but increasingly drawn to materialist explanations of nature. By the end of the 18th century, mechanical dolls had become a staple of both elite entertainment and popular spectacle. They traveled from court to fairground, from the salons of Paris to the streets of Vienna. They enchanted children, amazed philosophers, and unsettled theologians. They were celebrated as symbols of the Enlightenment and feared as signs of human hubris. Above all, they embodied the idea that intelligence and life could perhaps be understood not as mysteries but as problems to be solved, systems to be imitated, and processes to be replicated. The automata of this age did not think, but they taught people to imagine that thought might one day be constructed. They played with the line between art and life, and in doing so they prepared the cultural imagination for the much later leap to artificial intelligence. What began as mechanical dolls, ticking and whirring in candlelit chambers, whispered of a future in which the imitation of life would no longer be confined to gears and springs, but would venture into the territory of reason, learning, and consciousness itself. In the 17th century, as Europe moved through the upheavals of the scientific revolution, the question of whether thought itself could be explained in mechanical terms became one of the most provocative issues in philosophy. The rise of modern science encouraged thinkers to believe that nature could be understood through laws, mathematics, and mechanics, and that the mysteries of the human mind might be subject to the same scrutiny. Out of this intellectual climate emerged a body of thought that would deeply influence later visions of artificial intelligence. If the world was a machine, and the body a machine, then why not the mind as well? Could reasoning itself be reproduced in an artifice, a machine of thought? René Descartes stood at the heart of this debate. Famous for his assertion "I think, therefore I am," Descartes distinguished between the body, which he regarded as a mechanism, and the soul, which he saw as immaterial and indivisible. In his writings he often described the body in mechanical terms, comparing it to a clockwork device whose functions, movement, digestion, circulation, were governed by physical laws. He even entertained the idea that animals were little more than automata, creatures of instinct without true consciousness. For Descartes, however, humans were not reducible to this mechanical level, because the capacity for reason and self-awareness came from the soul, a gift beyond the reach of gears and levers. His position thus created a paradox. On one hand, he advanced the mechanistic view that encouraged engineers and philosophers to see the body as a machine. On the other, he drew a boundary around thought, reserving it for an immaterial substance that could never be reproduced artificially. Not all philosophers accepted this dualism. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a near contemporary of Descartes, imagined a more radical possibility. A mathematician and logician of extraordinary vision, Leibniz believed that thought could, in principle, be broken down into operations much like those of arithmetic. He dreamed of a universal language of logic, a calculus ratiocinator, that would allow human reasoning to be expressed in symbolic form and disputes to be settled by calculation. "Let us calculate," he famously declared, suggesting that arguments about truth could be resolved as easily as one might add numbers. For Leibniz, the mind was not an indivisible soul but a system whose processes could be understood, analyzed, and even imitated. His speculation that one day there might exist a machine of reasoning was more than metaphor. It was a blueprint for the kind of symbolic logic that would, centuries later, underpin the foundations of computer science and artificial intelligence. The tension between Descartes and Leibniz illustrates the broader debate of the time, one that echoed in theological, scientific, and philosophical circles. Was thought a divine mystery forever beyond human imitation, or was it a natural process that could be replicated by human ingenuity? Those who leaned toward the former preserved a sense of human uniqueness, maintaining that the soul, as immaterial essence, guaranteed dignity and free will. Those who leaned toward the latter opened the door to a more materialist view, in which intelligence might be seen as a set of operations, susceptible to mechanization. Each position had profound consequences. If thought was inseparable from the soul, then machines could only ever imitate life superficially. If thought was mechanical, then machines might one day rival or even surpass human reasoning. These debates were not abstract, they directly influenced the way inventors and scientists approached their work. The fascination with automata in the 18th century, from Vaucanson's flute player to the chess-playing Turk, was steeped in philosophical reflection. To many spectators, these machines were living demonstrations of Cartesian mechanics, proof that bodies could be imitated in elaborate detail. To others, they were hints of Leibniz's vision, showing that even activities associated with intelligence, like playing music or chess, might be broken down into mechanical steps. The more lifelike the automata became, the more pressing the philosophical questions appeared. Were these devices simply clever illusions, or were they glimpses of a future in which thought itself might be engineered? The influence of these early philosophical explorations reached far beyond their own century. Leibniz's dream of symbolic logic would eventually inspire George Boole's algebra of logic in the 19th century, which in turn became the foundation for digital computation. His idea that reasoning could be reduced to formal rules anticipated the algorithms of computer science. Descartes' insistence on the machine-like nature of the body paved the way for physiology and biology to analyze organisms as systems of interacting parts, a view essential to later developments in cybernetics and neuroscience. Even his dualism, with its sharp division between soul and body, foreshadowed ongoing debates about whether artificial intelligence could ever possess consciousness, or whether it would forever remain an imitation without inner awareness. In this way, the philosophical arguments of the 17th and 18th centuries did more than reflect the anxieties of their time. They provided a conceptual framework that continues to shape the discussion of artificial intelligence today. To imagine machines of reasoning is to stand in Leibniz's shadow. To doubt whether they could ever possess genuine thought is to echo Descartes. Every contemporary debate about whether artificial intelligence can really think, or whether it is merely simulating thought, carries within it the traces of this earlier struggle between mechanism and soul. The Enlightenment may not have produced thinking machines, but it produced the intellectual soil in which the very idea of them could take root, and from which the modern science of artificial intelligence would eventually grow. The 19th century brought with it a profound shift in the way people thought about machines, numbers, and the possibility of automating not just physical labor but also the work of thought. For centuries, devices had been designed to mimic life in the form of automata, fascinating audiences with lifelike gestures and mechanical theater. But in the 19th century a new kind of machine was imagined, one that would not merely imitate life but process information. This was the century when logic and computation were slowly disentangled from the exclusive domain of the human mind and given a new form in the language of mathematics and mechanics. The ambitions of a few remarkable thinkers, Charles Babbage, Ada Lovelace, and George Boole, created the intellectual scaffolding upon which the edifice of modern computing and, ultimately, artificial intelligence would be built. Charles Babbage was at the center of this transformation. Often described as the father of the computer, Babbage was an eccentric English mathematician and inventor who became frustrated with the tedious and error-prone nature of mathematical tables. In an age before calculators, navigators, engineers, and scientists relied on printed tables of logarithms and trigonometric values, which were compiled by human computers, men and women employed to perform long calculations by hand. The inevitable mistakes in these tables could have dangerous consequences, especially at sea or in construction. Babbage's irritation with these errors sparked his vision of a mechanical solution, a machine that could calculate with precision and reliability, free from human fallibility. His first design, the difference engine, was conceived as a mechanical calculator capable of generating polynomial functions using the method of finite differences. Though never completed in his lifetime due to financial and engineering difficulties, it demonstrated a bold new idea, that calculation could be automated through a set of mechanical processes. The difference engine was essentially a giant assembly of gears and levers, meticulously designed to embody mathematical relationships in physical form. Yet even as he struggled to realize this invention, Babbage was already imagining something more ambitious, something not limited to a single class of problems but capable of performing any kind of calculation. That dream took shape in his design for the analytical engine, conceived in the 1830s and 1840s. Unlike the difference engine, the analytical engine was not a specialized calculator but a general-purpose computing machine. Its design anticipated, in astonishing detail, many of the key components of modern computers. A store for holding numbers, analogous to memory, a mill for carrying out operations, similar to the central processing unit, input and output mechanisms using punched cards borrowed from the textile industry, and the capacity to perform conditional branching, which meant the sequence of operations could change depending on results obtained during computation. In essence, the analytical engine was the first serious attempt to imagine a programmable machine, a device that could follow instructions to carry out complex tasks beyond the ability of any one human. It was Ada Lovelace, the daughter of the poet Lord Byron, who grasped the deeper implications of Babbage's vision. A brilliant mathematician and thinker in her own right, Lovelace translated an Italian article about the analytical engine and supplemented it with her own extensive notes, which turned out to be far more significant than the original text. In these notes, published in 1843, she outlined how the machine could be programmed to perform tasks that went beyond mere number crunching. She described, for instance, how the analytical engine might manipulate symbols according to rules, thereby working not only with numbers but with abstract entities of any kind. Lovelace even suggested that such a machine could, in principle, compose music if the relationships of musical composition were properly expressed in mathematical form. Her insight was revolutionary. Where Babbage saw a machine that could eliminate human error in calculation, Lovelace saw the outlines of what we would now call general-purpose computing. She anticipated that the power of such a device lay not only in its ability to compute faster than humans but in its potential to extend human creativity into new domains. This made her, retrospectively, the first computer programmer, for she also wrote a detailed algorithm intended to be executed by the analytical engine. Although the machine was never completed, Lovelace's vision endures as one of the clearest early articulations of the possibilities of programmable intelligence. While Babbage and Lovelace wrestled with the mechanics of building machines to calculate and reason, George Boole was working on the abstract foundations of logic itself. A largely self-taught English mathematician, Boole published the mathematical analysis of logic in 1847, followed by an investigation of the laws of thought in 1854. In these works, he sought to formalize the process of reasoning by expressing it in algebraic terms. He devised a symbolic system in which logical operations such as and, or, and not could be represented mathematically, allowing statements to be combined and manipulated according to precise rules. At first, Boole's work was greeted with limited enthusiasm. Logic had long been the domain of philosophy, and the idea of mathematizing it seemed to some both unnecessary and obscure. Yet Boole's system was nothing less than the birth of symbolic logic, a way of treating reasoning as a kind of computation. His algebra of logic allowed complex arguments to be broken down into elementary operations, performed step by step with the certainty of mathematics. Though Boole himself could not have foreseen it, his symbolic logic would become the language of digital circuits in the 20th century. Every computer, every algorithm, every piece of artificial intelligence that processes information today owes something to the insight that thought could be represented and manipulated as symbols governed by rules. The convergence of Babbage's mechanical imagination, Lovelace's vision of symbolic computation, and Boole's logical formalism created a remarkable intellectual legacy. The analytical engine remained a blueprint rather than a functioning machine, but the principles behind it anticipated the architecture of modern computers. Lovelace's notes foreshadowed software, algorithms, and the broader notion that computation could extend beyond arithmetic into the realms of creativity and abstract reasoning. Boole's logic provided the theoretical language in which machines could be instructed and designed. Together, these contributions shaped the conceptual framework that would be rediscovered and realized in the 20th century, when electronics and digital technologies finally caught up with the boldness of their ideas. The 19th century did not yet produce a working computer or artificial intelligence, but it produced something perhaps even more valuable: the intellectual tools for thinking about them. It was an age when the dream of automata transformed into the dream of automating thought itself, when the spectacle of mechanical ducks and flutists gave way to the quieter but more revolutionary vision of machines capable of symbol manipulation. These ideas gestated for decades, even centuries, before they could be made real, but once unleashed, they became the foundation of the modern world. Today, every time a machine processes language, generates music, or learns from data, it is enacting in some form the aspirations of Babbage, Lovelace, and Boole. They may not have built a computer, but they built the future of computation, and with it the long road toward artificial intelligence. The decades of the 1930s and 1940s marked one of the most dramatic shifts in the history of ideas about intelligence, a period when long-held philosophical questions about thought and reasoning began to find concrete expression in machines. It was a time of intellectual ferment and crisis, of war and technological acceleration, when abstract mathematics, philosophical speculation, and practical engineering converged in ways that transformed not only the nature of machines but also the way humanity thought about itself. Out of this crucible emerged the foundations of modern computing and the discipline of cybernetics, developments that carried profound implications for the study of artificial intelligence. What had once been the province of automata makers and speculative philosophers now became the terrain of mathematicians, logicians, and engineers armed with new tools and new urgency. At the center of this transformation stood Alan Turing, a young British mathematician whose insights into the nature of computation remain central to the field today. In 1936, at just 24 years old, Turing published a paper titled On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungs problem. At the time, mathematicians were grappling with fundamental questions posed by David Hilbert about whether every mathematical statement could be decided as true or false by some finite procedure. Turing's answer to this problem was to imagine an abstract machine, later known simply as the Turing machine. This was not a physical device but a conceptual model, an infinite tape divided into squares, a read-write head that could inscribe symbols, and a finite set of rules governing the movement of the head and the transformation of the symbols. What made Turing's machine so revolutionary was its generality. He showed that such a machine, given the right set of instructions, could in principle carry out any computation that could be described as an algorithm. This abstract construction captured the essence of computation itself, reducing it to a matter of symbolic manipulation governed by rules. In doing so, Turing provided the theoretical blueprint for all digital computers that would follow. His proof that some problems could not be computed, no matter how clever the algorithm or how powerful the machine, also set limits to what mechanical reasoning could achieve. The Turing machine became more than a mathematical exercise, it became a way of thinking about the mind itself, suggesting that perhaps thought was nothing more than a sequence of rule-governed manipulations of symbols, just as Leibniz had imagined centuries earlier. Turing's ideas would not remain abstract for long. During the Second World War, he played a central role at Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking centre, where he applied his theoretical knowledge to the urgent practical task of deciphering German communications encrypted by the Enigma machine. Here he helped design electromechanical devices capable of rapidly testing vast numbers of possible cipher settings, early precursors to the programmable computers that would come in the following decade. His wartime work demonstrated that computation could be embodied in machines to achieve tasks that lay far beyond the unaided capacity of human reasoning, and it gave him a reputation that lent weight to his post-war reflections on the nature of machine intelligence. After the war, Turing turned explicitly to the question of whether machines could think. In a 1950 paper, he proposed a new way of framing the problem, one that avoided metaphysical debates about the nature of mind and soul. Instead of asking whether machines could really think, Turing suggested we should ask whether their behavior could be indistinguishable from that of a human. He introduced what he called the imitation game, now famous as the Turing test. In this imagined scenario, a human judge engages in a text-based conversation with both another human and a machine, without knowing which is which. If the judge cannot reliably tell them apart, Turing argued, then we have no good reason to deny the machine the attribute of intelligence. This pragmatic approach shifted the debate away from unanswerable questions of essence and toward observable performance, a move that continues to shape discussions of artificial intelligence today. While Turing was revolutionizing the theory of computation, another figure, Norbert Wiener, was laying the groundwork for a science that would unite machines, organisms, and communication under a single conceptual framework. Wiener, an American mathematician, was fascinated by the way systems regulate themselves through feedback, the process by which the output of a system is monitored and adjusted to maintain stability or achieve a goal. In 1948 he published Cybernetics, or Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine, a book that introduced the term cybernetics to describe this new field. For Wiener, the parallels between machines and living organisms were not metaphorical but structural. Both relied on feedback mechanisms. A thermostat regulates temperature by monitoring and adjusting heat, just as the human body maintains homeostasis through biological feedback loops. By analyzing these processes in mathematical terms, Wiener believed one could understand intelligence, adaptation, and control across domains. Cybernetics was as much a philosophy as a science, suggesting that the boundaries between life and machine, nature and artifice, were not as sharp as once believed. It inspired engineers, biologists, psychologists, and philosophers alike, and it provided a language for describing the kind of adaptive, goal-directed behavior that artificial intelligence would one day aspire to replicate. Meanwhile, the 1940s also saw the construction of the first electronic computers, machines that began to bring Turing's theoretical insights into tangible reality. Devices such as the ENIAC in the United States, completed in 1945, and the Colossus in Britain, built during the War for Code Breaking, demonstrated the immense power of electronic computation. These machines could process information at speeds unimaginable for human calculators, and though they were limited in flexibility compared to later designs, they revealed a future in which computation could become a central force in science, engineering, and even daily life. The development of stored program computers in the late 1940s, following the architecture proposed by John von Neumann, further advanced this transformation. The idea that a machine could store both data and instructions in the same memory allowed for far greater flexibility and programmability. A computer was no longer just a tool for solving a particular equation, it was a universal machine capable of executing any program that could be described in symbolic form. The von Neumann architecture turned Turing's abstract machine into a practical blueprint, setting the stage for the explosive growth of digital technology in the second half of the 20th century. The philosophical implications of these developments were profound. For centuries, the mind had been treated as something mysterious, perhaps divine, something beyond the reach of material explanation. but now machines were beginning to perform tasks that had once been the exclusive domain of human thought, calculating vast sums, following complex chains of logic, even simulating decision-making. If thought could be broken down into mechanical steps and carried out by a machine, then what distinguished human intelligence from artificial? Turing's test suggested that the distinction might lie not in some hidden essence but in observable performance. Wiener's cybernetics suggested that the same principles govern both brains and machines, uniting them in a single scientific framework. The early computers suggested that the mechanisms of thought might soon be not only understood but replicated on an unprecedented scale. Yet even in this moment of optimism and discovery, doubts remained. The early computers were powerful but rigid, capable of carrying out instructions with great speed but devoid of understanding. Critics asked whether imitation of thought was the same as thought itself, whether machines that followed instructions blindly could ever possess the creativity, intuition, or consciousness that characterized human minds. These questions would animate debates for decades, but the fact that they could now be asked seriously marked a fundamental change. The age of automata had given way to the age of computation, and with it the possibility of artificial intelligence entered not only the realm of imagination but the realm of serious scientific inquiry. The 1930s and 1940s thus marked the true birth of computing and cybernetics, a period when abstract theories of logic and mathematics were translated into machines of wires and vacuum tubes, and when the first glimmers of a science of intelligence began to emerge. Turing's vision of universal computation, Wiener's vision of feedback and control, and the practical realization of electronic computers all converged to redefine what machines could be and what intelligence might mean. In their wake, the boundaries between human and machine began to blur, and the question of artificial intelligence shifted from a matter of myth and philosophy to one of engineering and science. The world had changed, and with it the human understanding of thought itself would never be the same. The 1950s and 1960s were the moment when the long arc of speculation about artificial intelligence finally crystallized into an organized scientific discipline. The centuries of mythology, philosophy, logic, and mechanical ingenuity had set the stage, but it was during these decades that a group of mathematicians, engineers, and thinkers began to speak openly about creating machines that could perform tasks associated with human intelligence. It was an age of post-war optimism, when advances in electronics and computing seemed to herald an entirely new era of science, and when the very idea of intelligence was being redefined in terms of information, algorithms, and symbolic representation. The birth of AI as a field was not a smooth or unified process but rather the convergence of diverse lines of thought, ambitious projects, and bold claims, all coalescing around a sense that the dream of machine intelligence was no longer fanciful but within reach. The pivotal moment often cited as the official birth of artificial intelligence as a discipline was the Dartmouth Conference of 1956. Convened by John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Nathaniel Rochester, and Claude Shannon, the meeting was held at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, and funded by a modest grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. The proposal for the conference carried a strikingly confident statement, the belief that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence could in principle be described precisely enough that a machine could be made to simulate it. The organizers predicted that significant advances could be made by a small group of researchers working over the course of a summer. That confidence, some would later argue, was both the engine of early AI research and the seed of later disappointment, but at the time it marked an extraordinary leap from speculation to scientific agenda. The Dartmouth gathering brought together some of the most imaginative minds of the era, and while the meeting itself did not immediately produce breakthroughs, it created a shared vocabulary and sense of purpose. Out of this ferment emerged figures who would dominate the early decades of AI. Alan Newell and Herbert Simon at Carnegie Mellon University developed programs that sought to model human problem-solving. John McCarthy at MIT, later at Stanford, became the architect of many of the conceptual foundations and the inventor of the programming language Lisp, which became the lingua franca of AI research for decades. Marvin Minsky, also at MIT, combined deep mathematical training with a philosophical audacity, writing extensively on the possibilities of machine minds and founding one of the most important laboratories for AI research. One of the earliest demonstrations that machines could carry out tasks resembling reasoning was the logic theorist, created by Newell and Simon in 1956. This program was designed to prove theorems in symbolic logic, a domain that had long been regarded as a pure expression of human reasoning. Running on the primitive computers of the time, the logic theorist was able to prove dozens of theorems from Principia Mathematica, and in at least one case it even found a more elegant proof than the original human authors. Simon declared that the program was the first piece of software to be capable of thinking. Whether or not that claim was justified, the logic theorist represented a milestone, an explicit attempt to model human cognition in a computational framework. The ambition was not simply to build a useful program but to capture the processes of reasoning itself, suggesting that psychology and computer science might converge in the study of intelligence. John McCarthy, meanwhile, focused on creating the intellectual and technical infrastructure for AI. His invention of Lisp in 1958 was motivated by the need for a language that could naturally handle symbolic information, lists of data, and recursive operations, all essential for the manipulation of knowledge and reasoning. Unlike more rigid numerical languages, Lisp allowed researchers to express ideas in ways that closely matched the problems they were trying to solve. McCarthy also advanced the notion of time-sharing for computers, envisioning a future in which multiple users could interact with machines simultaneously, an idea that aligned with his broader vision of interactive, intelligent computing. He was also the one to formally coin the term artificial intelligence, giving the field a name that both captured its ambition and sparked controversy. Marvin Minsky brought a different sensibility to the enterprise, one that combined technical work with philosophical speculation. He believed strongly that intelligence could be explained as a collection of interacting processes, and he often wrote with a provocative confidence that machines would one day rival human capabilities. In 1961 he declared that within a generation, machines would be able to do any work a man could do, a prediction that captured both the exuberance and overconfidence of the era. At MIT, he helped establish the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which became a crucible for experimentation in machine vision, robotics, and symbolic reasoning. Minsky's writings and charisma helped sustain AI as a bold intellectual project even when progress was halting. The 1960s were a period of experimentation and exploration, when researchers sought to show that machines could exhibit intelligent behavior across a variety of domains. Some programs aimed at problem-solving and mathematics, others at language and conversation. One of the most famous of the latter was ELIZA, created by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT in the mid-1960s. ELIZA was a simple natural language processing program that simulated a Rogerian psychotherapist by reflecting questions back to the user and responding with formulaic prompts. Though the program had no real understanding of what was being said, many users nevertheless felt that ELIZA understood them. Weizenbaum himself was startled by the intensity of the responses, which revealed how easily humans could project meaning and empathy onto even the most rudimentary of conversational machines. ELIZA became a touchstone in debates about whether imitation of intelligence was equivalent to real understanding, echoing Turing's earlier ideas about the imitation game. These early programs, though primitive by modern standards, carried enormous symbolic weight. They suggested that activities once thought to be uniquely human, proving theorems, conversing, solving problems, could in principle be replicated by machines. They also raised questions about the nature of intelligence itself. If reasoning could be formalized and implemented in a program, what then distinguished human thought? Was understanding merely the manipulation of symbols, or was there something deeper, something machines could not capture? These debates, kindled in the early years of AI, would reverberate for decades, shaping both the aspirations and the criticisms of the field. The optimism of the 1950s and 1960s was fueled by rapid advances in computing power, a sense of limitless possibility, and the enthusiasm of a small but determined community. Researchers predicted that fully intelligent machines might be achieved within a few decades, and funding agencies, caught up in the excitement of the Cold War race for technological supremacy, were often willing to support ambitious projects. Yet the period was as much about laying conceptual foundations as achieving immediate results. The conferences, languages, laboratories, and early programs created a framework within which the discipline could grow. AI became a recognized field of research, with journals, funding streams, and academic departments, distinguishing it from the broader domain of computer science and giving it a unique identity. Looking back, the 1950s and 1960s appear both as a moment of extraordinary creativity and as the source of some of the myths that would later haunt AI. The early claims of imminent human-level intelligence proved wildly optimistic, and the limitations of the programs soon became evident. But the sheer boldness of the vision, the willingness to declare that intelligence itself could be captured in algorithms and code, set a trajectory that the field continues to follow. The logic theorist, Lisp, the Dartmouth Conference, and ELIZA may have been modest beginnings, but they marked the moment when artificial intelligence ceased to be a dream and became a discipline, when the question shifted from whether machines could think to how far and how fast their intelligence could grow. The decades of the 1960s and 1970s were marked by a dramatic oscillation between exuberant optimism and sobering disappointment in the field of artificial intelligence. After the Dartmouth Conference and the initial breakthroughs of the late 1950s, many researchers believed that the path to fully intelligent machines was only a matter of engineering and time. There was a sense, especially in the United States, that the convergence of computing power, logical formalisms, and symbolic programming would inevitably produce machines capable of human-level reasoning. This confidence was not just academic enthusiasm, it was fueled by a steady stream of military and governmental funding. In the Cold War environment, the promise of machines that could think, translate languages, or manage complex data was deeply attractive to governments who feared falling behind in technological supremacy. The military played an especially prominent role in funding AI research during this period. Agencies like the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, poured money into university laboratories, convinced that breakthroughs in machine translation, automated reasoning, and robotics could give the United States a decisive strategic edge. The idea that a machine might translate Russian texts into English or manage vast quantities of intelligence data was more than a curiosity, it was an imperative shaped by the geopolitical tension of the age. Similarly, automated planning systems and machine reasoning programs were imagined as tools that could help manage logistics, strategy, and even battlefield operations. Academic researchers benefited from this environment of generous support, which allowed them to build laboratories, train students, and explore bold ideas without immediate concern for commercial viability. Universities such as MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and Stanford became hubs of AI experimentation. Their laboratories were not only testing grounds for new algorithms but also cultural centers where young researchers absorbed a sense of mission, that intelligence was a problem that could be cracked by the right combination of logic, programming, and computer science. Graduate students worked on chess-playing programs, theorem provers, and early robots, each project serving both as a demonstration of progress and as a symbol of the discipline's relevance. There was an intoxicating sense that history was being made, that the intellectual project begun by Leibniz, Babbage, and Turing was about to flower into practical reality. Yet, beneath the surface of optimism, there were cracks. Computers of the era, even the most advanced mainframes, were limited in speed, memory, and storage. Programs that looked promising in theory quickly ran into computational bottlenecks when applied to more complex problems. Early successes often occurred in narrow, tightly constrained environments. A program might play a competent game of checkers or solve a few logic puzzles, but when presented with the unpredictability and richness of real-world situations, it faltered. Researchers sometimes underestimated the sheer complexity of tasks that humans take for granted, such as recognizing an object in a cluttered room or understanding the nuances of natural language. One of the first domains where optimism met resistance was machine translation. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, there had been grand promises that machines would soon be able to translate Russian texts into English with near-human accuracy. Pilot projects, often backed by military funding, produced initial results that seemed encouraging. But as the scale of the task grew, so did the recognition of how intractable natural language could be. Words had multiple meanings, syntax varied enormously, and context was indispensable. By the mid-1960s, evaluations of machine translation projects concluded that progress was far slower than anticipated, leading to skepticism about whether such programs were feasible with the computational resources available. Robotics and vision research faced similar challenges. Marvin Minsky, in 1966, famously assigned a graduate student the task of solving computer vision as a summer project, expecting that teaching a machine to recognize and interpret visual input would be relatively straightforward. The expectation proved disastrously overconfident. Vision turned out to be an enormously complex problem, one that involved not only perceiving shapes and edges but also interpreting them within a vast and dynamic context. Decades later, computer vision would still be one of the most difficult challenges in AI. The mismatch between optimism and reality began to erode the credibility of early claims, and the gap between promises and results grew increasingly difficult to ignore. By the early 1970s, funding agencies, particularly those influenced by governmental oversight, began to reassess their support for AI. Reports were issued that criticized the lack of tangible results despite years of investment. One of the most influential was the Lighthill Report of 1973 in the United Kingdom, which offered a blunt assessment of AI research. It argued that the field had overpromised and underdelivered, that progress was limited to toy problems, and that the grandiose visions of machines with general intelligence were far from realization. The report had devastating consequences for British AI, leading to a significant reduction in funding and a contraction of research efforts. In the United States, the mood was less severe but still marked by growing skepticism. DARPA, which had once enthusiastically supported a broad array of AI projects, began to demand more practical outcomes. Researchers found themselves caught between the ambition to pursue general intelligence and the need to produce short-term results that could justify continued investment. Some laboratories managed to sustain momentum by shifting focus toward more constrained applications, but the sense of boundless possibility that had characterized the 1960s began to fade. This period of waning enthusiasm is now remembered as the first AI winter, a time when the field's reputation suffered, funding contracted, and the broader scientific community grew doubtful about AI's promises. The phrase captures the chill that settled over a discipline once radiant with optimism. It was not that AI research stopped. Dedicated communities continued their work, and significant progress was made in specialized areas like expert systems and search algorithms. but the grand narrative that machines would soon rival human intelligence was put on hold. Researchers became more cautious in their claims, and the field entered a period of retrenchment. The irony of the first AI winter was that, while the discipline struggled with disappointment, it was also laying the foundations for future advances. Many of the algorithms, programming languages, and conceptual frameworks developed in this era would prove invaluable once computing power caught up in later decades. The winters of AI have often been less about absolute failure and more about the mismatch between aspiration and available technology. In the 1960s and 1970s, that mismatch was stark, and it forced the field into a more sober and realistic posture. Yet it would be misleading to see this period only as a decline. The excitement of the early years had planted seeds that would not wither entirely. Students trained during these decades would carry their expertise forward, laboratories would endure, and the problems identified then would become the challenges solved by future generations. The story of AI in the 1960s and 1970s is therefore not simply a tale of optimism followed by disillusionment. It is also a testament to the difficulty of the task, the resilience of the field, and the slow but steady accumulation of knowledge that, in time, would make possible the breakthroughs of later decades. The 1970s and 1980s brought with them a new wave of optimism in artificial intelligence, one that emerged after the sobering lessons of the first AI winter. If the grand dreams of general machine intelligence had proven elusive, researchers began to pivot toward narrower, more practical goals. Out of this pragmatic shift arose the concept of expert systems, programs designed not to replicate the totality of human thought but to capture the specialized knowledge of experts in well-defined domains. This approach was both a strategic retreat and a bold step forward, for it allowed AI researchers to demonstrate tangible results while sidestepping the enormous complexity of building fully general intelligence. The era of expert systems was marked by the creation of influential prototypes like Dendril and mycin, by the enthusiastic embrace of AI in commercial and industrial settings, and ultimately by the realization of the limits of this paradigm, a realization that once again cooled the fervor surrounding the field. Dendril, developed at Stanford University in the mid-1960s and refined through the 1970s, is often cited as the first true expert system. Conceived by Edward Feigenbaum, Bruce Buchanan, and Joshua Lederberg, it was designed to assist chemists in identifying molecular structures based on mass spectrometry data. The challenge was highly specific, given the spectral data, which possible chemical compounds fit the evidence. Dendril's power lay in its ability to encode the reasoning strategies of expert chemists, essentially capturing their heuristics and applying them systematically. The program did not understand chemistry in any broad sense, nor could it generalize beyond its narrow task, but within its domain it was highly effective. Dendril demonstrated that if one constrained the problem space, AI could produce genuinely useful results. It was an early and persuasive proof that the idea of codifying expertise in rule-based systems could yield practical tools. Building on this momentum, another Stanford project pushed the concept further. mycin, developed in the early 1970s by Edward Shortliff and colleagues, applied the expert system model to medicine, specifically to the diagnosis and treatment of bacterial infections. MyCin functioned by asking doctors a series of structured questions about a patient's symptoms, test results, and medical history, then using a knowledge base of rules to suggest diagnoses and recommend antibiotic treatments. Its recommendations were not only competent but in many cases on par with those of experienced physicians. What made mycin particularly significant was not just its medical competence but its underlying architecture, which included mechanisms for reasoning under uncertainty. Using a system of certainty factors, mycin could weigh probabilities and deal with incomplete or ambiguous data, a step closer to the complexities of real-world reasoning. Though it was never widely adopted in clinical practice, largely because of legal and ethical concerns about liability, mycin became a touchstone in the history of AI, illustrating both the promise and the limitations of expert systems. These pioneering projects inspired a surge of interest in AI across academia, government, and industry. The 1970s and especially the 1980s saw expert systems emerge as the leading paradigm of artificial intelligence, promising to bring the accumulated wisdom of specialists into software that could assist decision-making in a wide range of fields. Financial institutions began experimenting with systems to aid in loan decisions and fraud detection. Manufacturing companies invested in diagnostic systems that could detect equipment failures or optimize production processes. Corporations became eager to adopt knowledge-based systems, convinced that they could capture scarce expertise, reduce costs, and improve efficiency. The term knowledge engineering entered the lexicon, describing the painstaking process of interviewing experts, extracting their heuristics, and encoding them into rule-based frameworks. The commercial success of expert systems was not merely theoretical. By the 1980s, entire industries sprang up around AI software shells, general-purpose platforms like XCON, designed at Carnegie Mellon to configure computer systems for Digital Equipment Corporation. XCON saved December millions of dollars by automating the complex task of configuring customer orders, reducing errors, and speeding up production. Stories like this spread rapidly, fueling the perception that AI had finally found its killer application. Corporations hired knowledge engineers in droves, consultants promised revolutionary transformations, and AI firms attracted enormous investment. It was, in many respects, the first commercial boom of artificial intelligence, with expert systems serving as its flagship. Yet the very features that made expert systems successful also exposed their fragility. Rule-based systems were highly effective in narrow, stable domains, but they struggled when faced with the ambiguity, variability, and sheer messiness of real-world situations. Capturing expert knowledge was not a trivial matter. Experts often relied on tacit understanding and intuitive judgment, things that were difficult if not impossible to translate into explicit rules. As the number of rules in a system grew, sometimes numbering in the thousands, managing them became unwieldy. Small changes could have unpredictable effects, and maintaining the systems required constant attention. The promise of encoding expertise into neat logical structures ran up against the reality that expertise itself was often fuzzy, context-dependent, and resistant to formalization. Another limitation was adaptability. Expert systems were static, they did not learn from experience. Once the rules were encoded, the system could only operate within that fixed framework. If new situations arose, the knowledge base had to be manually updated, a process that was slow and expensive. This rigidity contrasted sharply with human experts, who could adapt their reasoning fluidly to novel circumstances. As industries tried to scale up expert systems, these weaknesses became increasingly apparent. Systems that had dazzled in demonstration sometimes faltered in practice, leading to frustration among users who expected more flexibility. By the late 1980s, the limitations of expert systems began to dampen the enthusiasm that had fueled their rise. Companies that had invested heavily in AI sometimes found that the returns did not match the hype. The cost of developing and maintaining systems was higher than anticipated, and the results often fell short of the grand promises made by vendors and consultants. Meanwhile, academic researchers grew restless with the constraints of rule-based reasoning. The field of AI began to look once again beyond expert systems, exploring neural networks, probabilistic reasoning, and other approaches that could offer greater flexibility and learning capacity. The decline of interest in expert systems did not mean that they vanished entirely. Many concepts developed during this period, from knowledge representation to inference engines, remained integral to later AI research. The commercial applications, though more modest than predicted, left a legacy of practical tools and demonstrated that AI could indeed deliver value in the right contexts. But as the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the aura of inevitability surrounding expert systems had dissipated, and AI found itself once again facing a chill in expectations. The story of expert systems is thus one of both triumph and limitation. They represented the first real bridge between academic AI research and widespread commercial use, proving that machines could embody specialized expertise and assist in complex decision-making. They also reveal the difficulties of capturing human knowledge in rigid rule-based form and highlighted the need for systems that could adapt, learn, and deal with uncertainty in richer ways. In their rise and decline, expert systems illustrated a recurring theme in the history of AI: the oscillation between dazzling success in narrow domains and disappointment when confronted with the full complexity of human intelligence. They were a necessary stage in the maturation of the field, a moment when the dream of machine intelligence came down from the lofty heights of generality and proved its worth in practice, even as it exposed the challenges that still lay ahead. The 20th century was as much an age of imagination about artificial intelligence as it was a century of scientific progress, for alongside the laboratories and conferences, a parallel story unfolded in the pages of novels, the glow of cinema screens, and the speculative thought of writers who asked what it would mean if machines could think, feel, or rebel. Long before most people encountered computers in their daily lives, they had already met them in fiction, where robots and artificial minds were granted personalities, ambitions, and flaws that reflected human hopes and fears. These imaginative portrayals did not merely entertain, they shaped the expectations of the public and even influenced the direction of scientific inquiry, embedding artificial intelligence in the cultural fabric before it fully existed in technical reality. Few figures were as central to this cultural shaping as Isaac Asimov, whose 3 laws of robotics became one of the most widely recognized attempts to imagine a moral framework for intelligent machines. Asimov's stories portrayed robots not as mindless automatons or monstrous creations but as complex entities capable of loyalty, error, and ethical dilemmas. His vision was striking because it humanized robots, turning them into characters with whom readers could empathize. At the same time, his careful embedding of laws designed to prevent harm highlighted the anxieties underlying technological progress. That machines might one day operate with autonomy and that their choices could profoundly affect human life. In Asimov's world, the question was not only whether machines could be intelligent but whether their intelligence could coexist with human safety and morality. His influence extended beyond fiction, as his ideas seeped into discussions of robotics, computer ethics, and even policy debates decades later. Arthur C. Clarke, another towering figure of the century, offered a different but equally haunting contribution through works such as 2001: A Space Odyssey. The film, directed by Stanley Kubrick but shaped by Clarke's narrative, gave the world one of its most enduring images of artificial intelligence in HAL 9000, the ship's computer. HAL was not a mechanical humanoid but a calm, disembodied voice that betrayed no emotion even as it made decisions with chilling consequences. The dissonance between HAL's polite, measured tones and its capacity for deception and murder struck a nerve with audiences, cementing the image of AI as something both indispensable and dangerously inscrutable. Clarke and Kubrick captured a fear that intelligence divorced from empathy might become alien and threatening, raising questions that echoed through later decades as real computers grew more powerful. Cinema expanded the palette of AI representation even further. In the 1920s, Fritz Lang's Metropolis had already introduced the robot Maria, a figure that blended awe and terror, serving as both a technological marvel and a source of chaos. Later films such as Blade Runner, based on Philip K. Dick's novel, explored what it meant to be human in a world where artificial beings, the replicants, were indistinguishable from their creators in appearance but denied recognition as persons. These stories turned AI into a mirror for human identity, probing whether consciousness and dignity depended on biology or could be extended to synthetic minds. By the late 20th century, robots and computers had become staples of film, ranging from the villainous, relentless Terminator to the endearing droid companions of Star Wars. This duality, machine as both destroyer and friend, reflected the ambivalence with which society regarded its technological offspring. In literature and film alike, AI was rarely neutral. It embodied extremes, either the loyal assistant, tirelessly serving human needs, or the uncontrollable entity that threatened its creators. This polarization played directly into public perception, for while most people had little contact with real artificial intelligence in the mid-20th century, they absorbed these fictional archetypes. The very word robot, popularized by Karl Apek's 1920 play R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, came to connote both servitude and rebellion, a dual meaning that colored every subsequent portrayal. Fictional machines dramatized questions that were philosophical at heart. If we build intelligence, will it obey, will it love, or will it turn against us? The cultural power of these portrayals cannot be overstated. When early AI researchers spoke to the public or sought funding, they often contended with images and expectations set by science fiction rather than by the realities of laboratories. The promise of computers that could converse like HAL or solve problems like Asimov's robots made the field seem tantalizingly close to breakthroughs. At the same time, fears of machines replacing humans, disobeying commands, or making cold, inhuman decisions fed skepticism and anxiety. Politicians, investors, and ordinary citizens often understood AI through the lens of stories rather than scientific reports, and this framing shaped the ebb and flow of support for the field. By the end of the century, the fictional AI had taken on a life of its own, evolving into a symbolic character in humanity's ongoing dialogue with technology. Whether represented as threatening or benevolent, these creations reflected human anxieties about control, morality, and the limits of knowledge. They also inspired generations of researchers, many of whom later admitted that their first fascination with AI came not from a textbook but from a film, a novel, or a comic in which machines dreamed, schemed, or sought freedom. In this sense, popular culture and scientific development were intertwined. The stories gave shape to the public imagination, and that imagination, in turn, fueled the ambitions of those who sought to make machines that could think. The story of neural networks in the 20th century is one of bold beginnings, harsh dismissals, and unexpected revivals. Few areas of artificial intelligence embody the cyclical rhythm of excitement and disappointment as clearly as the attempt to build machines that mimic the structure and function of the brain. From the first mathematical models of artificial neurons in the 1940s, through the rise and fall of the perceptron in the 1950s and 1960s, to the resurgence of interest in the 1980s with the rediscovery of backpropagation, neural networks moved from the margins to the center of debates about how machines could learn. Their journey illustrates the tension between simplicity and complexity, theory and practice, and the persistence of ideas that refuse to die even when temporarily out of fashion. The beginning of this story can be traced to Warren McCulloch, a neurophysiologist, and Walter Pitts, a young logician, who in 1943 published a paper that laid the conceptual foundation for artificial neural networks. They proposed a simple model of the neuron as a binary threshold unit. It would receive inputs, each weighted by strength, and if the combined input exceeded a certain threshold, it would fire. The elegance of the model lay in its abstraction, for it stripped away the messy biological details and focused instead on the logic of computation. McCulloch and Pitt showed that networks of such artificial neurons could, in theory, compute any logical function. In essence, they demonstrated that cognition could be understood as a matter of network logic, and in doing so, they established a bridge between neurobiology, logic, and the nascent field of computer science. The impact of their work was immense, even if the model itself was primitive, because it suggested that the architecture of the brain could be emulated mathematically, and that thought itself might be captured by circuits of artificial neurons. A little more than a decade later, Frank Rosenblatt pushed the idea further with the invention of the perceptron. In 1957, working at Cornell, Rosenblatt introduced a machine that could learn from data. Unlike the static model of McCulloch and Pitts, the perceptron could adjust its weights through a simple learning rule, strengthening or weakening connections depending on the examples it was shown. Rosenblatt's perceptron was a physical machine, built with wires, motors, and photosensors, and it attracted enormous attention. Newspapers hailed it as a breakthrough that might eventually lead to machines capable of vision, recognition, and thought. For the first time, a machine could be trained, not merely programmed, and the very word perceptron entered public discourse as a symbol of the possibility of machine learning. Rosenblatt himself was optimistic, predicting that perceptrons would one day rival the human brain in capacity, though he tempered this with recognition of the immense complexity still ahead. The perceptron represented a genuine leap, but it also revealed the fragility of neural network enthusiasm. While perceptrons could indeed learn to classify simple patterns, their mathematical structure imposed severe limitations. They were essentially linear classifiers, capable of separating data into categories only when those categories could be divided by a straight line. The classic example was the XOR problem. A perceptron could not solve a task as simple as distinguishing inputs that differed in one value while being the same in another. This limitation was devastating because it showed that perceptrons, for all their promise, could not represent many basic logical relationships. The critique that sealed the perceptron's fate came from Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert in their 1969 book Perceptrons. They carefully analyzed the capabilities and limitations of single-layer perceptrons, demonstrating with mathematical rigor that such systems were incapable of solving a wide range of problems. Although their book left open the possibility that multi-layered networks might overcome these obstacles, the dominant interpretation was that neural networks had reached a dead end. The timing was crucial, for artificial intelligence was competing for limited funding, and resources flowed instead toward symbolic approaches that promised more immediate success. The field of neural networks, which had briefly basked in attention, fell into disrepute, its researchers marginalized and its projects abandoned. For the next decade, neural networks were often dismissed as a failed path, a curiosity rather than a serious scientific direction. Yet ideas rarely vanish entirely, and beneath the surface, work continued. Some researchers refused to abandon the vision that machines could learn by adjusting networks of artificial neurons, and they searched for methods to train multilayer networks. The challenge was not only conceptual but computational. To adjust weights in a network with multiple layers required a way to propagate error signals backward through the layers, a process that demanded both mathematical clarity and sufficient computing power. The breakthrough came in the 1980s, when the algorithm known as backpropagation emerged as the key to unlocking the potential of neural networks. Backpropagation itself was not entirely new. Versions of the idea had been sketched earlier by several researchers, but it was the 1986 publication by David Rumelhart, Geoffrey Hinton, and Ronald Williams that crystallized its significance and brought it to wide attention. The essence of backpropagation was to calculate how errors in the network's output could be attributed to individual connections across multiple layers, allowing the network to adjust all its weights systematically in order to improve performance. With this method, multi-layer perceptrons could finally learn complex, non-linear relationships, solving the very kinds of problems that had doomed Rosenblatt's original perceptron. The timing of this revival was fortunate. By the 1980s, computers had become powerful enough to handle the intensive calculations required for training larger networks, and interest in alternatives to symbolic AI was growing after the limitations of expert systems became apparent. Neural networks, once dismissed, now reappeared as a promising paradigm, capable of handling tasks such as speech recognition, image classification, and pattern detection. Researchers demonstrated striking results, and the enthusiasm that had lain dormant since the 1960s began to reawaken. Still, the revival was not without its challenges. Neural networks of the 1980s were modest by today's standards, constrained by limited hardware and data. Training was slow, networks were relatively small, and the results were fragile. Yet the conceptual breakthrough was profound, the demonstration that layered, trainable networks could approximate complex functions, adapt to varied data, and embody a form of learning that was qualitatively different from symbolic reasoning. What had once seemed a dead end now looked like a fertile path, even if the journey ahead remained long. By the 1990s, neural networks were firmly back in the conversation, though they had not yet become the dominant force they would later become. Their revival coincided with broader debates in AI about connectionism versus symbolism, about whether intelligence was best modeled as a network of distributed units or as a system of explicit rules. In these debates, neural networks played the role of a challenger, embodying a vision of intelligence as emergent, adaptive, and grounded in statistical relationships rather than rigid logic. The arguments were sometimes heated, reflecting not only scientific disagreements but deeper philosophical questions about the nature of thought. The arc from McCulloch and Pitts to backpropagation illustrates both the fragility and the resilience of ideas in science. Neural networks were born in bold abstraction, stumbled in their early implementations, and were revived by a combination of mathematical insight and technological progress. They endure decades of neglect, only to re-emerge as a central paradigm in artificial intelligence. Their journey reminds us that scientific fields are not linear in their progress but cyclical, shaped by waves of enthusiasm, disappointment, and rediscovery. What seemed obsolete in one generation can return with transformative power in another. In the case of neural networks, the revival of the 1980s and 1990s prepared the ground for the explosive breakthroughs of the 21st century, when the seeds planted by McCulloch, Pitts, Rosenblatt, and their successors would finally bear fruit on a global scale. The closing decade of the 20th century and the opening of the 21st marked a decisive turning point in the history of artificial intelligence, not because machines suddenly became intelligent in the sense long imagined, but because the environment in which they operated underwent a profound transformation. The rise of the Internet, the rapid growth of computational power, and the accumulation of vast digital datasets reshaped both the practice and the ambition of AI research. Where earlier generations of scientists had been forced to wrestle with limited hardware and tiny samples of information, the new era provided a fertile ground of connectivity and abundance. Computers were no longer isolated tools tucked away in laboratories or corporate offices. They were becoming woven into the fabric of everyday life, linked by global networks that generated torrents of data. It was in this setting that statistical methods in machine learning gained prominence, enabling algorithms to find patterns in ways that began to feel less like programmed rule-following and more like a kind of learned adaptability. The growth of computational power played a central role in this transformation. Advances in microprocessors, the advent of cheaper and more powerful memory, and the steady acceleration described by Moore's law meant that the tasks which had seemed intractable only decades earlier could now be attempted with greater confidence. Problems that had defeated early AI researchers, speech recognition, image classification, natural language understanding, were not solved overnight, but they became tractable in ways that shifted the optimism of the field. The brute force required to train larger models, to experiment with deeper architectures, and to process immense amounts of data was no longer a dream for the future but a resource available in the present. At the same time, the Internet supplied an unprecedented quantity of information. Every email sent, every website visited, every uploaded photograph contributed to a growing ocean of data that could be mined for statistical regularities. Unlike the handcrafted rules and carefully curated examples that dominated earlier AI approaches, these new datasets provided raw material from the real world, messy and unstructured but vast enough to reveal patterns if analyzed with the right tools. This shift was not only technical but philosophical. Intelligence was increasingly conceived not as the rigid execution of symbolic logic but as the discovery of correlations and structures hidden in data. It was the birth of a data-driven paradigm that would define machine learning for decades to come. Statistical methods rose to prominence within this environment. Algorithms such as support vector machines, decision trees, and ensemble methods like random forests gained traction because they could generalize from data without requiring elaborate rules designed by human programmers. The focus moved toward training systems to infer solutions from examples, emphasizing adaptability over explicit instruction. This was the era when the phrase machine learning became central, marking a conceptual departure from earlier visions of AI as a set of symbolic reasoning engines. In practice, it meant that engineers and scientists were less concerned with imitating human thought in all its intricacies and more concerned with building systems that worked, systems that could recognize spoken words, filter spam, or predict user preferences. Breakthroughs in speech recognition illustrated the power of this shift. For decades, the dream of talking to machines had lingered on the edge of feasibility, plagued by errors and inconsistencies that rendered early systems unreliable. But as computational power increased and probabilistic models improved, systems became capable of parsing spoken language with a fluency that seemed almost magical compared to earlier efforts. By the early 2000s, voice-driven applications, while still imperfect, were functional enough to find commercial use in call centers, dictation software, and eventually consumer devices. What had once seemed an elusive goal, teaching machines to understand human voices, was becoming a daily reality. Similarly, image recognition underwent a renaissance. The combination of larger datasets and more powerful algorithms allowed systems to move beyond toy problems and begin to interpret complex visual scenes. Applications in medical imaging, security, and consumer photography began to demonstrate the utility of machine learning in vision tasks. Though deep learning would later transform the field dramatically, even before its explosion, statistical techniques were laying the groundwork, showing that with enough examples, machines could categorize objects, detect features, and recognize faces at levels approaching practical usefulness. These early successes hinted at a future where machines could navigate not only the abstract world of numbers but also the sensory world humans inhabit. The broader cultural effect of this period was equally significant. The Internet did not merely provide data for algorithms, it also provided visibility for the progress of AI. Search engines, recommendation systems, and personalized online experiences quietly integrated machine learning into daily life. Users often did not think of these as artificial intelligence, yet they were interacting with statistical learning systems every time they searched, clicked, or shopped online. AI ceased to be an abstract promise of the future and instead became an invisible infrastructure underpinning digital life. In retrospect, the 1990s and 2000s appear as a transitional period, a bridge between the symbolic struggles of the mid-20th century and the deep learning revolution that followed. They were years when AI did not yet dazzle with science fiction breakthroughs, but when the groundwork was laid through data, computation, and statistical learning. The world's connectivity and computational muscle finally caught up with ambitions that had once outpaced reality, and in doing so, they redefined the meaning of progress. It was no longer about crafting rules that embodied intelligence but about creating systems that could discover intelligence in the patterns of the world itself. In this shift lay the seeds of the extraordinary transformations that would follow in the next decade, when machine learning would evolve into something far more powerful than even its early champions dared to imagine. The decade of the 2010s is remembered as the era when deep learning moved from the periphery of artificial intelligence into its commanding center, transforming not only the research community but entire industries. Although the conceptual groundwork for neural networks had been laid long before, and the revival of multilayer perceptrons through backpropagation had given them new life in the 1980s, it was during this period that three figures, Geoffrey Hinton, Yann LeCun, and Yoshua Bengio, emerged as the architects of a revolution that would prove unstoppable. Their work, often pursued in defiance of the skepticism of mainstream AI, demonstrated that with enough layers, enough data, and enough computational power, artificial neural networks could achieve performance levels that surpassed traditional methods on tasks once thought to belong exclusively to human intelligence. The breakthroughs of this era reshaped computer vision, speech recognition, and natural language processing, and they ushered in the present world where chatbots, translation systems, and recommendation engines are part of daily life. The symbolic turning point came in 2012, when a group of Hinton students at the University of Toronto unveiled a model that would become known as AlexNet. Entered into the ImageNet large-scale visual recognition challenge, the network achieved an astonishing leap in accuracy, outperforming all competitors by a wide margin. What stunned the community was not merely that AlexNet won, but that its performance so dramatically outstripped the carefully engineered pipelines of traditional computer vision. AlexNet was a deep convolutional neural network trained on millions of labeled images, and it relied on GPUs, graphics processing units originally designed for rendering video games, to perform the immense number of matrix operations required. This clever repurposing of hardware allowed the training of networks far larger and deeper than before, and the result was a machine that could recognize and categorize objects in images with unprecedented precision. The 2012 victory was not only a scientific achievement but a cultural one, a moment when deep learning became impossible to ignore. The impact of AlexNet rippled far beyond computer vision. It signaled a shift in how researchers approached intelligence. Rather than designing handcrafted features, systems could learn representations directly from raw data. The idea of end-to-end learning, where neural networks ingested raw input and produced useful outputs without intermediary rules, became the new paradigm. In the years that followed, convolutional neural networks multiplied in size and sophistication, giving rise to architectures such as VGG, ResNet, and Inception, each pushing the boundaries of accuracy and efficiency. Tasks that had once seemed beyond reach, facial recognition at scale, medical image analysis, autonomous navigation, suddenly became feasible. Governments and corporations alike began pouring resources into deep learning research, recognizing its potential to redefine entire sectors of the economy. Speech recognition was another domain transformed by deep learning during this decade. For years, systems based on statistical models like hidden Markov models had achieved steady but limited progress, often producing results too error-prone for seamless interaction. The introduction of deep neural networks into acoustic modeling led to dramatic improvements. Companies such as Google, Microsoft, and Baidu began deploying deep learning systems that could transcribe spoken words with an accuracy that rivaled human stenographers. This leap enabled the rise of virtual assistants like Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant, which normalized the idea of speaking to machines as a daily convenience rather than a futuristic novelty. The intimacy of voice interaction reshaped consumer technology, embedding AI into homes, cars, and smartphones in ways that quietly redefined how people engaged with digital environments. The success in speech recognition naturally extended into machine translation, a task long regarded as one of the most challenging frontiers in AI. Early translation systems relied on phrase-based statistical models that often produced awkward, stilted sentences. With the introduction of deep learning, and particularly sequence-to-sequence architectures that used recurrent neural networks and later transformers, machine translation experienced a qualitative transformation. Systems such as Google Translate began producing fluid and coherent translations, narrowing the gap between human and machine understanding of language. The implications were profound, as barriers of communication that had defined cultural and linguistic divides for centuries began to erode under the pressure of instantaneous, accessible translation. The dream of universal communication, so long imagined in science fiction, was suddenly within sight. Chatbots and conversational agents also flourished in this environment. While early systems such as ELIZA had relied on pattern matching and scripted responses, the deep learning era enabled models that could generate contextually relevant replies, sustain multi-turn dialogues, and adapt to user input in flexible ways. Though still imperfect and often prone to errors or misunderstandings, these systems demonstrated a new level of sophistication that blurred the boundary between functional tool and conversational partner. Businesses adopted chatbots for customer service, while social platforms and personal assistants integrated conversational interfaces as a natural extension of user experience. The prospect of machines that could not only recognize speech but also converse meaningfully shifted the imagination of what AI could become, fueling both excitement and unease about its role in human life. What united these diverse breakthroughs was a common thread: the rediscovery that scale matters. The successes of the 2010s were not due to fundamentally new ideas alone, but to the combination of decades-old algorithms with the explosion of data and computation made possible by the Internet and modern hardware. Hinton, LeCun, and Bengio were sometimes referred to as the godfathers of deep learning, not simply because they invented these techniques, but because they nurtured them through years when most of the community had abandoned them. Their persistence, combined with the practical availability of GPUs and vast digital corpora, created the conditions for deep learning to thrive. The decade closed with deep learning not as an isolated branch of AI but as its beating heart, powering systems in healthcare, finance, entertainment, transportation, and beyond. ImageNet's victory in 2012 had seemed like a technical milestone, but in hindsight it marked the beginning of a structural transformation in how intelligence was conceived, built, and deployed. By the end of the 2010s, the question was no longer whether deep learning worked, but how far it could go, and what kinds of intelligence might emerge when scale and data were pushed still further. The era of deep learning in the 2010s was therefore more than a scientific trend. It was a cultural reorientation, a moment when machines began to learn not in the narrow, brittle sense of earlier programs, but in a way that evoked human adaptability. It was the decade when artificial intelligence stopped being primarily a promise and became a pervasive reality, embedding itself in the most ordinary acts of daily life. When we searched, spoke, looked, or listened, somewhere in the background, a deep neural network was shaping our world. The 2020s opened with artificial intelligence no longer a specialized tool for researchers and niche applications, but a force that reshaped how society understood knowledge, work, and even creativity. The breakthroughs of the previous decade, especially the rise of deep learning, set the stage for a wave of achievements that demonstrated not only technical prowess but also profound cultural and ethical consequences. In this era, systems like GPT, AlphaFold, and the rapid progress of autonomous machines captured both the imagination and the concern of the world. AI was no longer simply impressive in laboratories or competitions, it was writing essays, predicting protein structures, recommending medical treatments, driving cars, generating art, and raising questions about the very boundaries of human identity and agency. Among the most emblematic of these advances was the emergence of large language models such as GPT. Building upon the transformer architecture introduced in 2017, these models demonstrated a capacity to generate coherent, contextually aware text at a scale that surprised even their creators. Trained on vast swaths of internet data, GPT could write essays, compose poetry, draft code, and engage in conversation with a fluency that often felt indistinguishable from human expression. The impact was immediate and wide-ranging. Educators debated the implications for learning and plagiarism. Businesses began deploying chat-based assistants, and the general public found themselves confronted with a machine that seemed to understand them in ways no previous program ever had. The shock was not only technical but philosophical, reopening debates about what intelligence, creativity, and authorship mean when a statistical model can mimic them so persuasively. If GPT transformed the landscape of language, AlphaFold revolutionized science. For decades, one of biology's most intractable challenges had been the problem of protein folding, the process by which a sequence of amino acids assumes a three-dimensional structure essential for its function. The complexity of this problem had frustrated researchers and resisted computational attempts for half a century. Then, in 2020, DeepMind's AlphaFold stunned the scientific world by predicting protein structures with accuracy comparable to experimental methods, achieving in months what had eluded generations of biologists. This breakthrough was not simply an achievement in AI but a milestone for humanity's understanding of life itself, with implications for drug discovery, disease research, and synthetic biology. By unlocking the ability to model the molecular machinery of cells, AlphaFold promised to accelerate science in ways that might reshape medicine and biotechnology for decades to come. Parallel to these scientific and linguistic revolutions, autonomous systems advanced with steady momentum. Self-driving cars, once dismissed as perpetually 5 years away, began to demonstrate practical readiness in select environments. Companies tested fleets of autonomous taxis, delivery robots, and drones, while industries from agriculture to logistics explored automation on a massive scale. These developments revealed both the promise and the complexity of autonomy, the potential to reduce accidents, cut costs, and transform mobility, but also the risks of job displacement, unforeseen accidents, and the ethical dilemmas of machines making life-or-death decisions on the road. The very concept of autonomy in machines forced society to grapple with new definitions of responsibility and liability, raising questions about accountability when an algorithm, rather than a human, takes the wheel. Medicine was one of the fields most deeply transformed by AI in the 2020s. Beyond AlphaFold's contribution to molecular biology, machine learning systems began to assist doctors in diagnosing diseases from medical images, predicting patient outcomes, and tailoring treatment plans. Radiology, oncology, and genomics were all infused with AI-driven tools that offered a second pair of eyes, often spotting subtle patterns imperceptible to humans. During the COVID-19 pandemic, AI played a crucial role in tracking outbreaks, modeling the spread of infection, and accelerating vaccine research. The hope that AI could not only support but extend human healthcare became a tangible reality, even as concerns arose about privacy, bias in medical datasets, and the danger of over-reliance on algorithms in matters of life and death. Finance, long one of the earliest adopters of machine learning, also entered a new era of AI-driven transformation. Trading algorithms became more sophisticated, capable of parsing global news in real time and responding with strategies that outpaced human reaction. Risk assessment, fraud detection, and personalized banking services increasingly relied on predictive analytics powered by deep learning. AI's capacity to process enormous amounts of financial data enabled banks and investors to detect subtle correlations and anticipate market movements, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Automated trading systems could amplify market volatility, and the concentration of power in institutions with the most advanced AI raised fears about inequality and instability in global markets. The opacity of deep learning models further complicated regulation, as decisions that moved billions of dollars could not easily be explained even by their designers. Perhaps the most surprising domain of AI achievement in the 2020s was creativity. Tools based on large generative models began producing art, music, and literature that captivated audiences and blurred the line between human and machine artistry. Text-to-image models produce surreal or photorealistic paintings from short prompts, music generation systems composed symphonies or pop songs, and language models co-authored novels and screenplays. These systems raised fundamental questions about originality, ownership, and value. Was art less authentic if it was generated by a neural network trained on millions of human works? Could machines be considered creative, or were they simply remixing the creativity of countless individuals? The cultural debates that followed revealed both fascination and unease, as society confronted the possibility that creativity itself might no longer be an exclusively human domain. Yet alongside the exhilaration of these achievements came a deepening awareness of their ethical and societal challenges. The deployment of GPT-like systems brought with it the risk of misinformation, as machines could generate persuasive but false narratives at scale. Deepfake technologies amplified these fears, threatening to erode trust in media and public discourse. The biases encoded in training data surfaced in harmful ways, perpetuating stereotypes and discrimination when models were applied uncritically. In medicine and finance, the lack of transparency in decision-making created dilemmas of accountability, while in autonomous systems, the delegation of moral choices to algorithms unsettled public trust. Governments, researchers, and ethicists scrambled to develop frameworks for responsible AI, but the pace of innovation often outstripped the pace of regulation. Debates emerged over the ownership of data, the rights of creators whose work was used to train generative models, and the concentration of power in a handful of technology companies. The very ubiquity of AI made it difficult to imagine life without it, yet its risks underscored the need for caution. This tension defined the cultural atmosphere of the early 2020s, an oscillation between wonder at what had been achieved and fear of what might follow. As the decade progressed, it became clear that artificial intelligence in the 2020s was not only a story of technological triumphs but also of social transformation. GPT, AlphaFold, autonomous systems, and the wave of AI applications across medicine, finance, and creativity showed what machines could achieve when given data and computational scale. But just as important were the questions they forced humanity to ask about its own future. Could society harness these tools for collective good while safeguarding against their dangers? Could creativity, judgment, and responsibility remain distinctly human values in an age when machines began to imitate them so convincingly. The 2020s revealed that artificial intelligence had passed a threshold. It was no longer a field defined by potential, but by consequences. Every advance carried with it not only the promise of progress but the burden of choice. And in those choices lay the deeper story of AI in the modern age, where the boundaries between human and machine grew thinner, and the challenge was no longer to dream of intelligent machines but to live wisely alongside them. The future of artificial intelligence is a subject that invites both excitement and unease, for it is one of the rare fields where technological forecasts blur seamlessly with philosophical speculation. The trajectory of AI in the coming decades is not linear, nor is it guaranteed to follow the curve of past progress. Instead, it unfolds as a branching set of possibilities, each carrying implications that extend far beyond science and engineering. On one path, AI continues to evolve as a powerful set of specialized tools, deepening its role in medicine, finance, education, and countless other domains. On another, systems grow more general in their capacity to learn, reason, and adapt, leading toward the long-imagined horizon of artificial general intelligence. Somewhere further still lies the question of whether intelligence, once created outside the human mind, can transform society in ways we cannot yet predict, reshaping our notions of law, morality, and even existence itself. The notion of development paths is central to thinking about what comes next. One vision suggests that AI will steadily improve as a set of applied technologies, with models growing larger, more accurate, and more efficient. In this view, the future is not one of sudden leaps but of gradual refinement, systems that become better at diagnosing diseases, predicting weather, managing economies, or generating creative works. Another vision imagines a shift not just in degree but in kind, towards systems that exhibit general intelligence comparable to human beings. Such systems would not only master narrow domains but also transfer knowledge across contexts, reason abstractly, and pursue goals with flexibility. This leap, while speculative, is what many researchers refer to when they speak of AGI, a possibility that has haunted the dreams and fears of scientists, philosophers, and novelists for generations. Artificial general intelligence, should it emerge, would mark a turning point not just in technology but in human history. A system capable of reasoning broadly, learning autonomously, and adapting in open-ended environments would challenge our deepest assumptions about what it means to think. The consequences could be extraordinary. Solutions to global problems like climate change, disease, and poverty might be accelerated beyond imagination. Yet the risks are equally profound. A mind not constrained by human limitations could also act in ways misaligned with human values, and even subtle errors in design might scale into catastrophic outcomes. The very pursuit of AGI forces us to ask questions not only about feasibility but also about desirability. Should intelligence without humanity be pursued simply because it is possible? Or is there wisdom in restraint, in accepting the limits of what machines should be allowed to do? This is where philosophy, law, and morality enter the conversation with renewed urgency. Philosophers have long debated the nature of mind, consciousness, and ethics, but AI now brings these debates into the realm of practical necessity. If an AI system becomes sophisticated enough to engage in conversation about its own existence, do we owe it moral consideration, or is it merely an illusion of consciousness? If machines make decisions that affect human lives, how do we assign responsibility when harm occurs? The law, traditionally built around human agency, may need to evolve to account for entities that act with autonomy yet lack legal personhood. Questions of liability, rights, and obligations will become pressing as AI systems move from tools to collaborators and, potentially, to actors in their own right. Morality, too, is not a static backdrop but a living framework that will be tested by the choices societies make about AI. Who controls these technologies, and who benefits from them? Will the advantages of advanced AI be concentrated in the hands of a few corporations and governments, or distributed to improve the lives of many? Ethical dilemmas about privacy, bias, and surveillance will deepen as systems grow more powerful. More unsettling still are questions about human identity. If machines can think, create, and perhaps even reflect, what remains uniquely ours? Are we diminished by the presence of artificial minds, or are we extended, much as earlier tools extended our physical capacities? The future of artificial intelligence is thus not only a matter of engineering challenges but of collective choices. We stand at the intersection of potential paths, each promising and perilous in its own way. The development of AGI may never occur, or it may arrive sooner than anticipated, but either outcome demands preparation. To imagine the future of AI is to imagine the future of humanity itself, for these systems are not separate from us but expressions of our ingenuity, our ambition, and our uncertainties. Whether we guide them wisely or recklessly will determine whether AI becomes a partner in progress or a mirror reflecting our deepest flaws. What lies ahead is not merely the story of machines growing more intelligent, but of humanity deciding what intelligence is for, and how it should be shared. In that decision rests not just the fate of technology, but the fate of the values that define us.